In 1187, Saladin defeated the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin and recaptured Jerusalem. The city had been in Christian hands for 88 years. When his forces entered, there was no massacre. The Christian population was allowed to leave. Ransoms were set, and when many could not pay, Saladin paid from his own treasury. His enemy, Richard I of England, Richard the Lionheart, later said that if he had to lose Jerusalem, he was glad it had been to a man like Saladin. When Saladin died in 1193, his treasury contained 47 dirhams in silver and 1 piece of gold. He had given everything away. Archaeologists excavating his tomb in Damascus in the 20th century found it largely empty. The grave goods that should have accompanied a ruler of his power had been distributed to the poor before his death, consistent with everything the historical sources say about the man. Within 20 years of Saladin's death, his sons and brothers were at war with each other. Within 60 years, the dynasty he had founded was destroyed, not by the Crusaders he had defeated, not by the Mongols who were then consuming the Islamic world, but by the slave soldiers he had trained and trusted, who decided they could govern better than the family that had created them. So here is the question: how does the most respected ruler in the history of the Crusades leave behind an empire that his own family destroys in a single generation? To understand why Saladin mattered, you need to understand the world he was born into, a world in which the Mediterranean coastline of what is now Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine was divided among Christian Crusader states, Sunni Muslim rulers of varying degrees of power and competence, and Shia Muslim powers, whose theological differences from the Sunni mainstream made political cooperation with them complicated. The First Crusade of 1095 to 1099 had established 4 Christian states along the eastern Mediterranean coast: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. These states were, from the beginning, inherently vulnerable, small territories in a hostile geographic environment, dependent on continued reinforcement from Europe and lacking the agricultural and commercial base that would have made them self-sustaining. Their survival across the 12th century was a function of the political fragmentation of the Muslim world around them rather than of their own strength. The Sunni Muslim rulers of Syria and Mesopotamia were as preoccupied with competing against each other as with expelling the Crusaders, and the Fatimid Caliphate that controlled Egypt, Shia Muslim in theology, deeply hostile to the Sunni political establishment of the north, was more likely to seek alliance with the Crusaders against Sunni rivals than to join an Islamic coalition against the common Christian enemy. This fragmented political landscape was simultaneously the condition that had allowed the Crusader states to survive, and the condition that Saladin would have to change if he wanted to make their expulsion possible. A successful anti-Crusader campaign required the coordination of military resources from Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia under a single political authority, precisely the kind of political unity that the competing Muslim rulers had spent the preceding century preventing. The specific religious dimension of the conflict is important and should be understood clearly rather than through later nationalist or religious mythologies. The Crusades were motivated by a combination of genuine religious conviction, political calculation, economic incentive, and the specific social dynamics of a feudal European aristocracy whose surplus of military men with fighting experience and limited local opportunities made overseas military adventure appealing. The Muslim response to the Crusades was similarly complex. The concept of jihad was invoked, but its practical mobilizing power depended on political entrepreneurs willing to invest in building the military coalition that rhetoric alone could not assemble. Saladin was that political entrepreneur, but understanding how he became one requires understanding where he came from. A Kurdish military family from northern Iraq, whose trajectory through the military service of successive Muslim rulers in the Levant eventually placed his uncle Shirkuh, and then Saladin himself, in control of Egypt's military establishment at precisely the moment when Egypt's internal political weakness created an opportunity for a capable military commander to convert military command into political sovereignty. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whose throne name gives us the Western form Saladin, was born in 1137 in Tikrit, in what is now northern Iraq, into a Kurdish military family that had been serving the Zengid dynasty of Mosul and Aleppo for a generation. His father Najim ad-Din Ayyub and his uncle Asad ad-Din Shirkuh were both military commanders in Zengid service, and Saladin's childhood and early career were shaped by the specific military culture of that service, a world in which loyalty to one's commander, skill in mounted warfare, and the political intelligence required to navigate the competing factions of the medieval Islamic courts were the essential tools of advancement. The Kurdish identity of the Ayyubid dynasty is a historical fact that has sometimes been minimized in the later Islamic and Arab nationalist traditions that claimed Saladin as their own. Medieval Islamic historical sources, including the detailed biography written by Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who knew Saladin personally and served in his court, consistently identify the Ayyubid family as Kurdish in origin. Modern genetic studies of Kurdish populations and of the broader demographic history of the northern Fertile Crescent region confirm the deep historical presence of Kurdish-speaking populations in the areas from which the Ayyubid family came, consistent with the medieval historical sources. Saladin's rise to power in Egypt in 1169 was the consequence of a specific political crisis rather than a planned campaign of conquest. The Fatimid Caliphate that controlled Egypt in the mid-12th century was in terminal political decline. A succession of child caliphs controlled by competing viziers, each seeking to use the Crusader states or the Zengid rulers of Syria as counterweights against their domestic rivals. Saladin's uncle Shirkuh had been sent to Egypt by the Zengid ruler Nur ad-Din as a military intervention in one of these factional conflicts, and when Shirkuh died in 1169, Saladin, who had served in the expedition, was appointed his successor as vizier to the Fatimid Caliph. The transformation of Saladin from the Fatimid Caliph's military officer to the independent ruler of Egypt was accomplished with a combination of political skill and military force over the following 2 years. The death of the last Fatimid Caliph in 1171 allowed Saladin to declare restoration of Sunni Muslim authority in Egypt under the nominal sovereignty of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, the theoretically supreme authority of the Sunni Muslim world whose actual power was limited, but whose symbolic legitimacy remained important. By 1174, with the death of Nur ad-Din, Saladin had the opportunity to extend his authority from Egypt into Syria, and the subsequent decade of military and diplomatic consolidation brought under his control the territory stretching from Egypt through the Levant to northern Mesopotamia. The archaeological evidence for the Ayyubid period in Egypt is substantial and increasingly well documented. The citadel of Cairo, begun by Saladin in 1176 as the new center of Egyptian military and political power, has been the subject of extensive archaeological investigations since the mid-20th century, and the findings from excavations within and around the citadel have provided detailed information about its construction phases, its material culture, and the specific engineering solutions that Ayyubid builders employed in constructing a fortification on the Muqattam Hills above Cairo. Egypt's geographic position, controlling the Nile River Valley, the most productive agricultural land in the medieval Middle East, while also sitting at the junction of the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, and the overland routes connecting Africa to Asia, made it the most valuable territory in the medieval Islamic world and the essential foundation for any power seeking to build a regional empire capable of contesting Christian control of the Levant. The Nile's annual flood cycle, the inundation that deposited fresh alluvial soil across the valley and delta each summer, renewing the agricultural productivity that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 4,000 years, generated agricultural surplus that no other territory in the region could match. The specific combination of flood-irrigated agriculture, the Nile's function as a transportation artery connecting the agricultural hinterland to the Mediterranean coast, and Egypt's position as the natural intermediary between the Mediterranean trade world and the Red Sea trade routes to India and East Africa, gave the country a revenue-generating capacity that made it the fiscal backbone of the Ayyubid Empire. Cairo, established by the Fatimids in 969 CE as the new Shia Muslim capital of Egypt, on the east bank of the Nile, approximately 20 kilometers south of the Mediterranean coast, was by Saladin's time one of the largest cities in the world, with a population variously estimated by medieval sources at between 500,000 and 1,000 people. The city's physical infrastructure, its water supply from the Nile, its drainage systems, its markets, its residential neighborhoods, and its religious institutions, represented an urban development of extraordinary scale and complexity. Saladin's most significant contribution to Cairo's physical landscape was the construction of the citadel, the fortified complex on the Muqattam hills that became the seat of Egyptian military and political power, and remained so until the 19th century. The citadel was designed specifically to command the approaches to Cairo from multiple directions and to provide a defensible base that could sustain a garrison through a prolonged siege. Its construction required the reorganization of Cairo's water supply. An aqueduct system connecting the citadel to the Nile was built specifically to ensure that the fortification's garrison could be maintained independently of the city's water infrastructure. The defensive geography of Egypt as a whole was one of the factors that made Saladin's control of the country a strategic asset rather than simply a revenue source. The desert margins of the Nile Valley, the Western Desert to the west, and the Sinai Peninsula to the northeast, provided natural barriers against overland military invasion that reduced the territory's vulnerability to the kind of rapid military campaigns that could destabilize inland kingdoms. An invader seeking to attack Egypt needed either to cross the Sinai, a difficult logistical undertaking, as the Crusaders discovered on multiple occasions, or to mount a naval expedition against Alexandria and the Mediterranean coast, which required capabilities that the Crusader states, without a significant navy of their own, could not easily assemble. The military and political consolidation that transformed Saladin from the vizier of a dying Fatimid caliphate into the sultan of a unified empire, stretching from Egypt through Syria to northern Mesopotamia, took approximately 15 years, from 1169 to 1186, and was achieved through a combination of military campaigns against Muslim rivals, diplomatic management of the Crusader states, and the construction of a personal reputation for justice and generosity that proved to be a genuine political asset. The military campaigns against other Muslim rulers, particularly the Zengid princes of Syria and Mesopotamia, whose territories Saladin progressively absorbed, are the most politically uncomfortable dimension of Saladin's career from the perspective of the Islamic unity narrative that later historiography constructed around him. He was not, during these years, fighting the Crusaders. He was fighting other Muslims. His justification that the unification of Muslim political authority was the necessary precondition for an effective campaign against the Crusaders was genuine, and the strategic logic was correct. But the specific campaigns involved sieges, battles, and the political elimination of Muslim rivals whose supporters at the time and critics subsequently have questioned. The agricultural reforms that Saladin implemented in Egypt during his consolidation of control significantly increased the revenue available to the Egyptian government. The reassessment of agricultural land productivity, the reorganization of irrigation management, and the elimination of some of the more exploitative practices of the Fatimid fiscal system generated revenue that Saladin used to fund the military establishment he was building. The specific fiscal arrangements, including the ICTA system of revenue assignments to military commanders that he adapted from earlier Islamic practice, provided the incentive structure that kept his commanders loyal and his army maintained without constant recourse to the central treasury. The Crusader states, which Saladin managed diplomatically during his consolidation phase through a combination of truces, commercial agreements, and the occasional small-scale military engagement, were not his primary focus during these years. He needed time to build the military coalition that could defeat them, and the commercial relations between his territories and the Crusader ports, particularly the continuation of Egyptian trade through Crusader-controlled Acre, provided economic benefits to both sides that created incentives for maintaining the peace that Saladin needed. The strategic moment came in 1187. The truces that had maintained an uneasy peace had been violated by the Crusader Lord Raynald of Chatillon, who had raided a large Muslim caravan in clear breach of the existing agreement. Saladin's response was to assemble the largest army he had ever commanded and move it against the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. The Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187 is one of the most studied military engagements of the medieval period, and the combination of tactical intelligence, strategic patience, and physical ruthlessness with which Saladin conducted the campaign that produced it represents the most complete expression of his military system in operation. The Ayyubid military was built around a core of heavy cavalry, the faris, armoured horsemen equipped with lance and sword, whose battlefield role combined the shock action of a cavalry charge with the sustained combat capability of well-armed and well-mounted soldiers. The light cavalry that surrounded this heavy corps mounted archers who could harry enemy formations, disrupt supply lines, and screen the movement of the main force, provided the tactical flexibility that allowed Ayyubid commanders to choose the terms of engagement rather than simply responding to enemy movements. The Mamluk soldiers who formed the most elite units of the Ayyubid military were, like their counterparts in the Delhi Sultanate, slave soldiers trained from childhood in the arts of war and organized around personal loyalty to the commander who had purchased and elevated them. The Ghulam, slave soldier, institution that the Ayyubids employed drew on a long tradition of Islamic military organization in which the specific disadvantages of slave status, the slave's total dependence on his master's favor, his lack of family connections that might divide his loyalty, his having nothing to lose by complete commitment to military service, were deliberately cultivated as military virtues. Mamluk soldiers of the Ayyubid period were, by contemporary accounts, among the most capable military professionals in the medieval world. The tactical plan that produced the Battle of Hattin was built around Saladin's understanding of the Crusader army's vulnerabilities. The Crusaders of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had an effective military but specific logistical constraints. Their heavy cavalry required large amounts of water. Their horses were less well adapted to the heat of the Levantine summer than Saladin's lighter mounted forces, and their political decision-making process, requiring consultation among the kingdom's major lords and the religious orders, was slower and more contentious than Saladin's unified command. Saladin manipulated these vulnerabilities deliberately. He provoked the Crusaders into advancing by threatening the city of Tiberias. He cut their line of march to the water sources they needed. On July 3 and 4, as the Crusader army was desperate with thirst and surrounded by Saladin's forces on the plateau of Hattin, he set fire to the dry grass around them. The smoke added to the army's physical suffering and psychological distress. When the Crusaders' final charge broke against the Ayyubid line, the battle was effectively over. The casualties among the Crusader military, approximately 20,000 soldiers killed or captured, including the King of Jerusalem, the Grand Masters of the major military orders, and Raynald of Chatillon, whom Saladin personally executed, effectively destroyed the Crusader kingdom's military capacity. Jerusalem fell 3 months later, without the siege that the city's garrison knew was coming and knew it could not sustain. Saladin's personal character, the qualities that made him remarkable even to his enemies, is better documented than that of almost any other medieval Muslim ruler. because the Third Crusade that followed the fall of Jerusalem brought him into extended contact with European chroniclers who wrote accounts of their campaigns that include detailed observations of the man they were fighting. The biography of Saladin, written by Bahar ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who served in Saladin's court as a judge and advisor and observed him closely for the last years of his life, is the most detailed and authoritative of the primary sources. Ibn Shaddad describes a man of genuine religious conviction whose daily practice of Islamic devotion was consistent and sincere, a ruler whose administration of justice was hands-on and personally engaged in a way unusual for monarchs of his power and position, and a commander who was capable of extraordinary tactical flexibility in the field while maintaining the strategic patience that his long campaign of political consolidation required. The specific incidents that the sources record in detail, Saladin sending his personal physician to treat a sick Richard I of England during the Third Crusade, his provision of ice for the cooling of the enemy commander who was ill, his repeated gestures of generosity toward prisoners and toward the populations of cities he captured, were not simply personal kindness. They were also deliberate political acts in an environment where a ruler's reputation for keeping his word was a genuine strategic asset. Rulers who treated enemies honorably could negotiate truces that held. Rulers who massacred prisoners found future enemies fought to the death rather than surrendering. The political system Saladin built for the Ayyubid Empire reflected his understanding that the personal loyalty he had cultivated could not be directly institutionalized. He distributed territories, Syria, Egypt, and the other parts of the empire, among members of his family, creating a confederation of Ayyubid princes who acknowledged his overall authority while governing their specific territories with considerable autonomy. This system had the advantage of making the empire's governance decentralized enough to function without his personal presence everywhere, simultaneously. It had the fatal disadvantage of making the empire's unity dependent on his personal authority to hold the competing family interests together. When Saladin died in Damascus on March 4, 1193, he had ruled the most extensive Muslim empire since the early Abbasid period, and had demonstrated at Hattin and in the subsequent campaigns what unified Muslim military power could accomplish against the Crusader states. He left behind an empire distributed among his sons and brothers, a family tradition of mutual suspicion and competition for territory, and no institutional mechanism for resolving disputes among Ayyubid princes that did not involve military conflict. For the majority of the population living within the Ayyubid Empire's territory, the farmers of the Nile Valley and the Syrian countryside, the craftsmen and merchants of Cairo and Damascus, the soldiers and administrators of the military and civil establishments, daily life was shaped by the combination of the Nile's agricultural rhythms, the commercial activity of the region's cities, and the constant background awareness of military conflict along the Crusader frontier. The agricultural population of Egypt lived in close relationship with the Nile flood cycle, whose annual rhythm organized the agricultural calendar, the tax collection schedule, and the movement of goods through the river-based transportation network. The Fellahin, the Egyptian peasant farmers, who cultivated the Nile Valley, had been doing so in essentially the same way for millennia, and the Ayyubid administration's primary interaction with them was through the tax collection apparatus that extracted a fraction of the agricultural surplus for the government. The urban population of Cairo was more directly affected by the Ayyubid administration's policies and more directly exposed to the commercial activity that the empire's position as an intermediary between Mediterranean, Red Sea, and overland trade generated. The specific trades that concentrated in Cairo's various specialized market districts, the gold and silver workers, the textile merchants, the spice traders, the booksellers, reflected the city's function as both a regional commercial center and a node in the long-distance trade networks that connected the Mediterranean world to India and East Africa. The food culture of the Ayyubid period in Egypt and Syria was already a sophisticated synthesis of multiple culinary traditions, Egyptian, Iranian, and the Levantine regional traditions that had been combining for centuries. The cookbooks that survive from the medieval Islamic period, including the 13th century Kitab al-Tabiq, the Book of Dishes, written in Baghdad during the period of Ayyubid regional dominance, describe a cuisine of considerable complexity and variety, using the spices, dried fruits, and aromatics that flowed through the Ayyubid trade networks in dishes that combined sweet and savory elements in ways that influenced subsequent culinary traditions across the Islamic world and, through the Crusade period's cross-cultural contact, into European cooking as well. The plague epidemics that periodically swept the medieval Middle East, including significant outbreaks in Egypt in the Ayyubid period, were documented by the court physicians who served the Ayyubid sultans and whose medical knowledge drew on the full tradition of Islamic medicine, itself a synthesis of Greek, Indian, and original Arabic medical scholarship. The hospitals, bimaristans, that the Ayyubid rulers established in Cairo and Damascus represented genuine investments in public health, infrastructure whose sophistication exceeded what contemporary European cities were providing, and whose documentation in the sources provides historians with detailed information about medieval Islamic medical practice. Cairo and Damascus, the two cities that served as the dual centers of Ayyubid power, were in the late 12th and early 13th centuries among the most significant urban centers in the medieval world, and the architectural, commercial, and intellectual life they sustained during the Ayyubid period represents one of the peaks of medieval Islamic civilization. Cairo's physical transformation under Saladin and his successors was concentrated in two main areas: the fortification program centered on the citadel and the extension of the city walls, and the religious and educational building program that established the Sunni Islamic institutional infrastructure to replace the Fatimid Shia institutions that Saladin had systematically dismantled after taking power. The citadel of Cairo, whose construction began in 1176 and continued under Saladin's successors, represents the most ambitious military engineering project of the Ayyubid period. The specific technical challenges of constructing a major fortification on the Muqattam Hills, a limestone plateau, above the city that provided excellent defensive visibility but required specialized engineering solutions for water supply and foundation stability, were addressed with the full resources of the Ayyubid military engineering tradition. The walls of the citadel, constructed of quarried limestone using mortar compositions that have preserved the structure remarkably well across 8 centuries, were designed to the standard of the most advanced military architecture of the period. The aqueduct system that supplied the citadel with water from the Nile, stretching approximately 5 kilometers from the river to the base of the Muqattam Hills, then elevated to the citadel level through a series of towers and channels, was a hydraulic engineering achievement of genuine sophistication. Archaeological investigation of the aqueduct's surviving sections has revealed construction details that indicate a sophisticated understanding of hydraulic principles, including the use of settling tanks to remove suspended sediment from the river water before it entered the storage cisterns. Damascus, which had been the political center of the Zengid dynasty before Saladin's consolidation brought it under Ayyubid control, was a city of comparable importance and even greater historical depth. The Umayyad Mosque at Damascus's center, built in 705 CE on the site of a Byzantine church, whose fabric incorporated an even older Roman temple, was one of the greatest religious and architectural monuments of the Islamic world, and its restoration and maintenance during the Ayyubid period was a statement of dynastic legitimacy as much as religious devotion. The commercial infrastructure of both cities was built around the Khan and the Souk, the caravanserai that provided accommodation and secure storage for long-distance merchants, and the specialized market streets where specific trades concentrated. The surviving medieval souks of Damascus, partially preserved within the old city that is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, give a physical sense of the commercial density and organizational sophistication of the Ayyubid period urban market, though the specific buildings that survive mostly date to later periods rather than to the Ayyubid era itself. The religious dimension of the Ayyubid Empire was, in a more direct and immediate sense than in most of the other empires discussed in this series, inseparable from its political identity. Saladin had built his political legitimacy on the claim to be the champion of Sunni Islam against the Shia, Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, the Crusader states in the Levant, and the various Muslim rulers whose political behavior he characterized as insufficiently committed to the defense of the Islamic community. This religious framing was not simply propaganda. The historical sources consistently indicate that Saladin's own religious conviction was genuine, but it was also a political tool whose implications were carefully managed. The Sunni Islamic revival that Saladin promoted in Egypt was implemented through the systematic replacement of Fatimid Shia religious institutions with Sunni ones. Fatimid mosques were converted to Sunni practice. Fatimid religious endowments were redirected to Sunni institutions. The Azhar Mosque, established by the Fatimids as a center of Shia Islamic learning, was repurposed from its Shia function during Saladin's reign, though it was subsequently restored to importance as a Sunni institution under the Mamluk dynasty that succeeded the Ayyubids. The madrasa, the Islamic educational institution dedicated to the study of religious law, theology, and the related sciences, was the primary vehicle through which Saladin promoted Sunni Islamic learning in Egypt and Syria. He established multiple madrasas in both Cairo and Damascus, endowing them with the revenue from specific properties in ways that gave them financial independence from political fluctuations. The intellectual culture that these institutions supported, the study of Islamic jurisprudence, theology, hadith literature, and the related sciences of Arabic language, was genuinely productive during the Ayyubid period, and several of the most significant scholars of medieval Islamic civilization were active in Ayyubid patronized institutions. The Sufi tradition, as in other medieval Islamic contexts, was an important dimension of religious life during the Ayyubid period, providing a form of devotional practice and communal organization that complemented rather than replaced the formal religious institutions of the madrasas and mosques. Saladin and his successors maintained relationships with leading Sufi masters whose spiritual authority provided a form of popular religious legitimacy that the more formal institutions could not supply. The Khanqahs, Sufi residential and meeting places that the Ayyubids founded and supported in Cairo and Damascus, were significant institutions in the religious and social life of both cities. Saladin's treatment of Jerusalem after its capture in 1187 was a deliberate contrast to the massacre that the Crusaders had carried out when they captured the city in 1099, an event that the Islamic world had never forgotten and whose reversal, through a demonstration of Islamic moral superiority, Saladin clearly intended. His decision to allow the Christian population to ransom themselves and leave, to maintain the security of the civilian population during the transition, and to preserve the Christian holy sites, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was both a sincere expression of his religious values and a calculated political statement about what Islamic governance of a holy city could look like. The technological capabilities of the Ayyubid Empire were, in several specific areas, at or near the leading edge of medieval practice, a function both of the Islamic world's access to the accumulated technological knowledge of the Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions it had absorbed, and of the specific military and commercial incentives that drove technological development in the Ayyubid context. The siege technology that Ayyubid engineers deployed, the mangonels, trebuchets, and the counterweight catapults that were the most powerful missile weapons available in the medieval world, was as sophisticated as anything available to the Crusaders they faced. The specific engineering knowledge required to construct, maintain, and aimed these machines with useful accuracy was embedded in the core of military engineers who served in both Ayyubid and Crusader armies, and the cross-cultural exchange of siege technology during the Crusade period was in fact bi-directional. Both sides learned from each other. The Greek fire, the incendiary weapon that had been used in Byzantine naval warfare and that the Islamic world had inherited and adapted, appeared in Ayyubid military operations as a siege weapon and naval weapon whose specific formulation was a closely guarded military secret. The medieval sources describe its use in the Crusader Wars in terms that suggest a weapon of genuine terror, a substance that burned on water and could not be extinguished by conventional means. The specific chemistry of Greek fire remains a subject of historical and scientific debate, with modern researchers proposing various combinations of petroleum distillates, quicklime, and other substances as candidates for the compound's active ingredients. The astronomical knowledge of the Ayyubid period was transmitted through the tradition of Islamic astronomy that had been developing since the 8th century, drawing on both Greek astronomical heritage. The works of Ptolemy had been translated into Arabic in the 9th century, and original Islamic observation and mathematical development. The astronomical instruments produced in Ayyubid period Egypt and Syria, astrolabes, quadrants, and the specialized devices for determining the direction of Mecca and the times of prayer were of high quality and demonstrated the mathematical sophistication of the craftsmen who made them. The astronomical knowledge embedded in these instruments had practical applications in navigation, agriculture, and military operations. Determining the best timing for a military movement or a siege required understanding of the lunar calendar and the seasonal patterns that affected visibility, weather, and the availability of water. The medical knowledge that circulated in Ayyubid period Cairo and Damascus represented the accumulated scholarship of Islamic medicine, itself a synthesis of Greek, Indian, and original Arabic medical thought at its most developed. The hospitals that Saladin and his successors established provided institutional settings for both medical practice and medical education, and the physicians who staffed them were among the most learned medical practitioners of the medieval world. Ibn Jubayr, the Andalusian traveller who visited Damascus in 1184, described the Nuri hospital founded by the Zengid ruler Nur ad-Din as the most impressive medical institution he had encountered in his extensive travels, a testimony to the standard of medical care that the cities of the Ayyubid sphere were providing. The enemies that destroyed the Ayyubid Empire were not the Crusaders that Saladin had defeated, not the Mongols whose campaigns were consuming Central Asia and then the Middle East, but the members of Saladin's own family whose competition for territory and precedence dismantled the political unity he had spent his career constructing. The distribution of Ayyubid territories among Saladin's sons and brothers that had been his chosen method of governing a large empire created, within a generation of his death, a system of competing Ayyubid principalities whose rulers were simultaneously family members bound by common kinship and political rivals competing for primacy within that family. The specific territorial arrangements Saladin made on his deathbed, giving Egypt to his son Al-Afdal, Damascus to another son Al-Aziz Uthman, and Aleppo to yet another son Al-Zahir, proved almost immediately unstable. Al-Aziz Uthman of Egypt and Al-Afdal of Damascus were at war within 3 years of their father's death. Saladin's brother Al-Adil, who had been the most capable military commander of the later Ayyubid campaigns and who had served as Saladin's trusted subordinate for decades, used this conflict to position himself as the stabilizing force that both competing princes needed, accumulating political influence and eventually displacing Al-Afdal and establishing himself as the dominant figure in the Ayyubid family by 1200. Al-Adil's reign, from approximately 1200 to his death in 1218, represented the Ayyubid Empire's last period of coherent overall authority. He managed the family's competing claims with considerable skill, distributing territories among his sons and nephews, while maintaining his own pre-eminence in ways that kept the most destructive conflicts within manageable bounds. But his own death triggered the same pattern. His sons competed for primacy. The Ayyubid principalities of Syria and Egypt pursued independent foreign policies that sometimes directly conflicted with each other, and the Crusader states, reduced to a coastal strip after Hattin but reinforced by the 5th and 6th Crusades, exploited the divisions between Ayyubid princes to recover territory and diplomatic advantage. The most damaging specific incident in the Ayyubid interfamily conflict was the 6th Crusade of 1228 to 1229, during which the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil of Egypt negotiated the return of Jerusalem to the Crusader leader Frederick II of Sicily, not because he was militarily defeated, but because the political threat posed by his own Ayyubid relatives in Syria made the deal with Frederick more attractive than continued military commitment to the defense of Jerusalem. The Muslim world's reaction to this diplomatic surrender of the Holy City that Saladin had recaptured at such cost was, as contemporary sources document, one of outrage and disbelief. Al-Kamil's calculation that a truce with the Crusaders was less dangerous than military conflict, while his family rivals threatened him from the north, was locally rational. It was also a precise illustration of how Ayyubid family politics had, by 1229, completely inverted the strategic priorities that Saladin had established. The Ayyubid Empire, at its territorial maximum, approximately during Saladin's lifetime and in the years immediately following his death before the family competition began its most destructive phase, controlled territory stretching from Egypt through the Levant and Syria into northern Mesopotamia, with additional territories in Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula that gave the dynasty control of the Red Sea trade routes and the approaches to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The wealth that this territory generated, through the combination of Egyptian agricultural surplus, Levantine commercial revenue, and the income from the Indian Ocean trade that passed through Ayyubid-controlled Red Sea ports, was, at the dynasty peak, sufficient to fund both the military establishment that defended and expanded the empire and the religious, educational, and architectural patronage that built its cultural legacy. The commercial geography of the Ayyubid Empire placed it at the intersection of three major trade systems: the Mediterranean trade, in which the ports of Alexandria, Acre, and the Levantine coast connected Europe and North Africa in a dense network of commercial exchange; the Red Sea trade, through which Indian Ocean commodities, spices, textiles, precious stones, and manufactures entered the Mediterranean world via the Egyptian Red Sea ports, and the overland route to Cairo and Alexandria, and the overland trade through Syria and Mesopotamia that connected the Mediterranean world to Persia, Central Asia, and the routes leading to China. The control of this commercial geography gave the Ayyubid sultans, particularly the sultans of Egypt, who sat at the junction of the Mediterranean and Red Sea trade systems, a revenue base and a diplomatic leverage that extended well beyond the military power of their armies. The specific commercial privileges that the Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa maintained in Ayyubid-controlled ports were subjects of diplomatic negotiation in which the Ayyubid sultans held significant bargaining power, and the management of these commercial relationships was one of the most sophisticated dimensions of Ayyubid statecraft. The cultural production of the Ayyubid period, the architecture of Cairo and Damascus, the religious and educational institutions Saladin and his successors founded, the scholarly activity they patronized, was substantial and in several areas represented genuine peaks of medieval Islamic civilization. The architectural synthesis of the Ayyubid period, combining Egyptian, Syrian, and Mesopotamian building traditions in fortress construction, mosque design, and madrasa architecture, created a visual language that shaped the subsequent Mamluk architecture of Egypt and Syria for the next 2 centuries. The process by which the Ayyubid Empire moved from the peak of Saladin's achievement to the dynasty's final collapse in 1260 took less than 70 years, a span shorter than a human lifetime, and the specific mechanisms of that decline illuminate, with unusual clarity, the structural weaknesses that made the dynasty's collapse not just possible but, in retrospect, nearly inevitable. The succession crisis that Saladin's death in 1193 triggered was not resolved by Al-Adil's consolidation of authority in 1200. It was merely suppressed. The Ayyubid political system had no legitimate mechanism for choosing a dynasty head other than the personal authority of the most powerful individual family member, and that authority was non-transferable. When Al-Adil died in 1218, the suppressed competition resumed. The Fifth Crusade of 1217 to 1221, which targeted Egypt directly, landing at Damietta on the Nile Delta with the intention of capturing Cairo, revealed in acute form how the Ayyubid family's political dysfunction affected military decision-making. The military defense of Egypt against the Fifth Crusade was conducted, for most of the campaign, by Al-Kamil, the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, while his brothers and cousins in Syria were engaged in political maneuvering against each other, rather than providing the military reinforcement that a coordinated Ayyubid response would have required. The eventual defeat of the crusade, achieved partly through military action and partly through the flooding of the Nile Delta, which trapped the Crusader army, was not the decisive Islamic victory that a unified Ayyubid response might have produced. The Mongol campaigns that destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad in 1258 and reached Syria in 1259 to 1260 found the Ayyubid principalities of Syria in their characteristic state of mutual competition and political fragmentation. The Mongol commander Hulagu's campaign through Syria, capturing and sacking Aleppo, taking Damascus, met Ayyubid resistance that was brave but disorganized. The specific Ayyubid rulers of the Syrian principalities made individually rational calculations about whether to submit or resist the Mongols, with the result that neither organized resistance nor coherent submission was achieved, and the military capability of the Syrian Ayyubid states was effectively destroyed without being effectively employed. The economic deterioration that accompanied the decades of political conflict was cumulative and severe. Agricultural investment declined when land tenure was uncertain. Commercial activity contracted when political instability made long-term business planning impossible. Military spending remained high throughout the conflict period, funded by the liquidation of the accumulated reserves that Saladin's careful fiscal management had built. By the 1250s, the Egyptian Ayyubid Sultanate, the wealthiest and most productive component of the empire, was facing fiscal pressures that its rulers were managing by increasing reliance on and concessions to the Mamluk military corps. The end of the Ayyubid dynasty came not from external military conquest, but from the internal political logic of the Mamluk military system that the Ayyubids had created and on which they had become dependent. The Mamluks, the slave soldiers who had been the elite military force of the Ayyubid army since Saladin's time, had, by the mid-13th century, developed their own political consciousness and institutional identity to a degree that made them a power within the Egyptian state capable of independent political action. The specific trigger for their intervention was the attempt by the last Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, Turan Shah, to displace the Mamluk commanders who had effectively governed Egypt during his predecessor's illness with commanders of his own choosing. Turan Shah had been brought from a provincial governorship to Cairo in 1249 after the French crusade under Louis IX had captured Damietta and threatened Cairo itself. The Mamluk commanders, led by Baybars and the commander Aybak, had organized and won the Battle of al-Mansura in February 1250, one of the decisive battles of the Crusader period in which the French army was surrounded and King Louis IX was captured. This was a genuine Mamluk military achievement, accomplished by soldiers who had spent their careers in the army and who had developed the tactical expertise and institutional culture to defeat the Crusaders under pressure. When Turan Shah attempted to sideline these commanders in favor of his own clients, The Mamluks' response was immediate and decisive. In May 1250, Turanshah was assassinated by Mamluk officers, stabbed during a feast, pursued when he attempted to flee into the Nile, and killed on the riverbank. The dynasty that Saladin had founded 60 years earlier ended in that moment, on the banks of the Nile, killed by the soldiers it had created. The Mamluk Sultanate that replaced the Ayyubids proved to be, in military terms, the most effective Islamic state of the medieval period. It was the Mamluks who defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, the first significant Mongol military defeat by a non-Mongol force in open battle since the initial expansion of the Mongol Empire. It was the Mamluks who systematically expelled the remaining Crusader states from the Levant over the following decades, completing the work that Saladin had begun at Hattin, and it was the Mamluks who maintained Egypt as the centre of the Islamic world during the period when the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258 had eliminated the Abbasid Caliphate and left the broader Sunni Muslim world without its traditional institutional centre. In a very real sense, the Mamluk victory over the institution that had created them was not a repudiation of the Ayyubid military tradition. It was the ultimate expression of it, the slave soldiers proving definitively that they had mastered the craft of war and governance better than the family that trained them. The Ayyubid Empire ended in 1260, but its physical, cultural, and institutional legacy has been more continuously visible than that of most medieval Islamic dynasties, because the two cities at its centre, Cairo and Damascus, remained major metropolitan centres whose ongoing habitation preserved the Ayyubid layers of their urban fabric while simultaneously burying them under subsequent development. Saladin's tomb in Damascus is the most direct surviving physical connection to the dynasty's founder. Located in the Umayyad Mosque complex, the tomb was restored in 1898 by the German Emperor Wilhelm II, who donated the white marble sarcophagus that now covers Saladin's remains, a gift that reflected the European romanticism about Saladin that had developed over centuries and that had made him, uniquely among medieval Muslim rulers, a figure celebrated in Western as well as Islamic historical memory. The restoration was well-intentioned, but has complicated the archaeological study of the original tomb, whose specific features are difficult to assess through the 19th century intervention. The physical investigation of Saladin's remains, a limited examination conducted by a team of researchers in the 20th century, found skeletal evidence consistent with the historical source's account of his death from a fever, though the specific cause of the fever could not be determined from the physical evidence available. The broader archaeological investigation of the Damascus sites associated with the Ayyubid has been limited by the continuous occupation of the old city, whose medieval fabric is preserved within the modern urban environment in ways that restrict systematic excavation, and by the specific political conditions of the 20th and 21st centuries that have affected research access to Syrian archaeological sites. The citadel of Cairo, the most significant Ayyubid architectural legacy in Egypt, has been under continuous investigation by Egyptian and international archaeological teams since the mid-20th century, and the findings from this work have significantly revised the understanding of its construction history and its relationship to the broader urban development of medieval Cairo. The discovery of hydraulic infrastructure associated with Saladin's original construction, cisterns, channels, and the foundations of water lifting mechanisms, has confirmed the sophistication of the engineering that supplied the citadel with water and has provided detailed information about the specific technical solutions that Ayyubid engineers employed. The genetic legacy of the Ayyubid period in the populations of Egypt, Syria, and the broader Middle East is difficult to isolate from the longer history of population movement and mixing in the region. The specific contribution of the Ayyubid ruling class, Kurdish in origin, incorporating Turkish and Arabic elements through intermarriage during the dynasty's century of rule, is traceable in the genealogical traditions. that some families in Egypt and Syria maintain, but the genetic signature is too small and too distributed to be identifiable in population level. Studies. The cultural legacy of the Ayyubid period is most clearly visible in the architectural tradition that the dynasty's building programs established. The Ayyubid synthesis of Egyptian, Syrian, and Mesopotamian architectural elements, in fortress construction, in madrasa design, in funerary architecture, created a visual language that the subsequent Mamluk dynasty adopted, adapted, and extended to produce some of the finest Islamic architecture of the medieval world. The Mamluk buildings of Cairo and Damascus, now UNESCO World Heritage Sites, are the architectural grandchildren of the Ayyubid tradition, and understanding them requires understanding the Ayyubid synthesis from which they developed. The lesson that the Ayyubid Empire most directly teaches is one about the relationship between personal genius and institutional design, specifically about what happens when personal genius creates something that the institutions around it cannot sustain. Saladin's achievement at Hattin and Jerusalem was genuine and extraordinary. His political system for governing the empire he had created was not designed to outlast him. He distributed power among family members because family loyalty was the only institutional form of loyalty he had available, and family loyalty, as the history of the subsequent 60 years demonstrated with brutal clarity, dissolved into family competition the moment the authority that had held it together was gone. The military institution that did outlast him, the Mamluk Corps, whose training and organizational culture Saladin had invested in systematically, proved, paradoxically, more durable than the family dynasty he had tried to create. The Mamluks defeated the Crusaders his family had partially surrendered Jerusalem to. The Mamluks stopped the Mongols his family had failed to coordinate against. And the Mamluks created an institutional framework that governed Egypt for 2.5 centuries after the Ayyubids were gone. Saladin gave his last dirham away. His family fought over the empire he had built. His slave soldiers kept the Islamic world together when it needed keeping. That is not a comfortable story, but it is an honest one, and it poses, directly and without the possibility of evasion, the question that every leader who builds something must eventually answer. What happens to what I have built when I am no longer here to hold it together? For Saladin, the answer was given by his own family, in his own capital, in blood. There is a single event in the Ayyubid Empire's post-Saladin history that crystallizes more completely than any other how thoroughly family competition had inverted the dynasty's founding mission. It happened in 1229, 36 years after Saladin's death, and it is one of the stranger diplomatic episodes in medieval history. Frederick II of Sicily, Holy Roman Emperor, excommunicated by the Pope, simultaneously the most powerful Christian ruler in the Mediterranean world and the man the Catholic Church had officially cast out of it, arrived in the Levant in 1228 without an army capable of serious military operations to negotiate the return of Jerusalem with the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil of Egypt. Al-Kamil was at this moment in serious political difficulty. His Ayyubid relatives in Syria were threatening his authority from the north. A rebellion in his own territory required military attention. The Crusader presence in the Levant was a constant strategic complication. What Al-Kamil needed was a settled frontier that would free his military attention for the more immediate threat posed by his own family. What Frederick II offered was exactly that, a negotiated peace framed as a treaty but functionally a strategic concession by the Muslim side. In exchange for Frederick's recognition of Al-Kamil's authority and a cessation of Crusader military pressure, Al-Kamil agreed to return Jerusalem to Christian control for a period of 10 years, along with Bethlehem, Nazareth, and a corridor to the coast. The Islamic holy sites on the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque would remain under Muslim control, and Muslims would retain the right of religious access to the city. The reaction in the Islamic world was one of genuine shock. Jerusalem was the city that Saladin had recaptured at Hattin's cost, the city whose recovery had been the culminating achievement of the greatest Islamic military campaigns since the early caliphate. Al-Kamil had given it back without military defeat in exchange for a diplomatic settlement that served his dynastic interests against his own family members. The Muslim religious establishment in Jerusalem refused to hold the Friday prayer in the mosques while a Christian king held the city. The Qudi of Jerusalem, Shams ad-Din, wrote a lament that has survived in medieval Islamic literature, a description of the desolation of the sacred sites under Christian authority, addressed to the wider Islamic world as an appeal for the sense of outrage that, in his view, should have prevented the treaty from being made. The specific political logic that produced the Treaty of Jaffa, as the 1229 agreement is known, was fully understood by Al-Kamil's contemporaries. It was not that he did not value Jerusalem or did not understand its religious significance. It was that he valued his own political survival and his position within the Ayyubid family competition more than he valued the abstract principle that Jerusalem should remain under Muslim sovereignty. This was precisely the kind of calculation that Saladin's political architecture, distributing the empire among family members, made not just possible, but, given the incentive structure it created, nearly inevitable. The historian Amin Maalouf, in his work on the Crusades from the Arab perspective, identified the Treaty of Jaffa as the moment that most clearly reveals how completely the Ayyubid dynasty had abandoned Saladin's mission. The man who had spent 20 years building a military coalition to recapture Jerusalem left behind a dynasty whose members within 2 generations were giving it back to the Crusaders as a diplomatic concession in a family political dispute. This is not ultimately a story about Islam or Christianity or the specific politics of the medieval Levant. It is a story about what happens when the institutions of governance are built around a single person's authority rather than around principles and procedures that can survive that person's absence. Saladin was extraordinary. The system he built for governing after himself was not designed to last, and the gap between the man and the system produced, within 60 years, one of the most complete collapses in the history of any dynasty that had achieved comparable heights. The Mamluks who replaced the Ayyubids understood this lesson. Their institutional design, slave soldiers whose primary loyalty was to the core rather than to any individual, commanders who rose through demonstrated military competence rather than family connection, was specifically designed to avoid the single point of failure that had destroyed the Ayyubids. It worked. The Mamluk Sultanate lasted 2.5 centuries. The Ayyubid Empire, from its founder's death to its dissolution, lasted less than 70 years. Saladin's tomb in Damascus is still there. The white marble sarcophagus that Wilhelm II donated in 1898 sits above the grave of the man who gave away his last coin and left behind an empire that his family could not keep. Above the tomb in the chamber that the Umayyad mosque complex has preserved across 8 centuries, the Arabic inscription that marks his resting place reads, "God have mercy on this Sultan, conqueror of Jerusalem. He liberated Jerusalem. His sons gave it back. History writes its own endings. They are rarely the ones the protagonist would have chosen.